cold silence. The fog clung to Bucharest like a shroud, its tendrils curling through the narrow streets, swallowing the dim glow of gas lamps that flickered like fading pulses. The city, in 1978, seemed to exist outside of time, its crumbling facades and shadowed alleys whispering of decay and forgotten secrets. Dr. Emil Grigor, 34, stepped off the tram at the edge of the old quarter, his coat pulled tight against the biting wind. His breath fogged in the air, curling like a ghost before dissipating into the night. A forensic pathologist by trade, Emil carried the weight of a tarnished reputation. A medical malpractice lawsuit in Cluj-Napoca had stripped him of his career and his pride. Now, this desolate morgue in Bucharest's heart was his last chance at redemption, or perhaps his final descent into oblivion. The municipal morgue squatted at the end of a narrow street, its brutalist concrete facade streaked with black mold, as if the building itself were rotting from within. The windows, opaque with grime, stared blankly into the fog, their surfaces reflecting nothing but the city's despair. Emil paused at the entrance, his hand hovering over the heavy iron door. A faint hum emanated from within, like the drone of a distant machine, or perhaps the city itself groaning under its own weight. He pushed the door open, and the air inside hit him like a physical force, thick with the sterile bite of formaldehyde, undercut by the metallic tang of blood. The silence was oppressive, a tangible weight pressing against his ears, broken only by the faint buzz of fluorescent lights overhead. At the reception desk, an old man sat hunched over a tattered ledger, his face a map of wrinkles and shadows. His name tag, pinned crookedly to his threadbare jacket, read Vasile. His eyes, watery and yellowed, flicked up to meet Emil's, and for a moment, they seemed to hold a warning, a glint of something ancient and knowing. "You're the new doctor," he rasped, his voice like gravel grinding underfoot. "Grigor, yes." Emil nodded, setting his leather satchel on the counter. "That's me. First night." Vasile's lips twitched, not quite a smile, but something closer to pity. "Keep your wits about you, boy. This place, it doesn't like the living." He leaned closer, his breath sour with tobacco and age, his voice dropping to a whisper. "And whatever you do, stay away from cold room 4. Emil forced a chuckle, dismissing the words as the ramblings of an old man steeped too long in the morgue's gloom. "I'll keep that in mind," he said, signing the logbook with a flourish. Vasile handed him a ring of keys, each one cold and heavy, their edges worn smooth by years of use. The old man's gaze lingered on him, heavy with unspoken meaning, before he turned back to his ledger, muttering something under his breath that Emil couldn't catch. The morgue's corridors stretched before him like a labyrinth, the walls peeling paint in long, curling strips, the air thick with the scent of decay. The fluorescent lights buzzed erratically, casting fleeting shadows that danced at the edge of his vision. His footsteps echoed, too loud in the oppressive quiet, as he made his way to the autopsy suite. The room was a cavern of stainless steel and white tile, the air so cold it seemed to cling to his skin, seeping into his bones. A single autopsy table sat at the center, its surface gleaming under the harsh lights, flanked by trays of surgical tools that glinted like teeth. The refrigeration units lined the back wall, their steel doors etched with numbers, their hum a low, constant pulse that seemed to reverberate through the room. Emil set up his workspace methodically, arranging his tools with the precision of a man clinging to routine. Scalpels, forceps, bone saws, each found its place, a small act of control in a place that felt anything but. He glanced at the clock on the wall, 11:47 p.m. His first night shift loomed ahead, an endless stretch of hours in this frozen tomb. He pulled on a pair of latex gloves, the snap of the rubber loud in the silence, and began reviewing the logbook. Names, dates, causes of death, a litany of the city's dead, each entry a story cut short. Heart attacks, overdoses, accidents, all mundane, all expected. But as he flipped through the pages, a single entry caught his eye: Lina Ionescu. No date of death. No cause of death. The absence of details was jarring, a violation of protocol that set his nerves on edge. He glanced at the refrigeration units, his eyes drawn to the door marked 4. It was just a drawer, he told himself, just another part of the job. But Vasilei's warning echoed in his mind, a splinter he couldn't dislodge. He shook his head, trying to focus on the task at hand, but the silence seemed to thicken, pressing against his eardrums like water at the bottom of a lake. The refrigeration unit's hum shifted, taking on a rhythm that felt almost deliberate, like a heartbeat. Emil's pen paused over the logbook, his hand trembling slightly. He told himself it was just the cold, the late hour, the weight of his own exhaustion. But the air seemed to grow colder, the chill seeping through his coat, his skin, his very thoughts. The clock ticked over to 12:03 a.m. His first night shift had begun. Emil moved to the refrigeration units, beginning his inventory. Each drawer slid open with a hiss, revealing bodies pale and still, their faces frozen in the finality of death. He cross-referenced each one with the logbook, his pen scratching notes in a steady rhythm. But when he reached cold room 4, he stopped. The drawer was locked, a heavy padlock securing the handle, its surface pitted with rust. He tested it, tugging gently, but it held firm. He checked the keyring, flipping through the keys, but none fit. A faint unease prickled at the back of his neck, a sense that the morgue was watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. He returned to the desk, his journal open before him, and wrote, 12:47 a.m. Cold room 4 is locked. Logbook entry for Lina Ionescu incomplete. No key found. The words felt like a confession, an acknowledgement of something he wasn't ready to face. He glanced at the security monitor mounted on the wall, its grainy feed showing the row of refrigeration units. The image was still, unchanging, but something about it made his skin crawl. He leaned closer, squinting at the screen, and for a moment, he thought he saw a flicker, a shadow moving behind the glass of cold room 4's door. His breath caught, but when he looked again, the image was clear, the drawer silent and still. He stood, his chair scraping against the tile, the sound jarring in the quiet. He approached the units, his flashlight beam cutting through the dimness. The padlock on cold room 4 was untouched, the drawer sealed. He shone the light through the small glass window, but the beam revealed nothing but darkness. No body, no movement, just an empty void. Yet the unease in his chest grew, a tight knot that refused to loosen. He turned away, his heart thudding, and forced himself to focus on the inventory. But as he worked, the silence seemed to shift, no longer empty but alive, watching him from the shadows. The clock ticked on, each second stretching into eternity, and Emil couldn't shake the feeling that he was no longer alone. The autopsy suite was a sterile fortress, its walls unyielding, its air sharp with the scent of disinfectant. Emil worked through the inventory of bodies, his hands steady despite the unease that had settled in his chest like a stone. The logbook lay open on the desk, its pages yellowed and curling, filled with the meticulous handwriting of countless predecessors. Each drawer in the refrigeration units had a corresponding entry, name, date of death, cause of death, all neatly catalogued, a testament to the order of death. All except one. Cold room 4. Emile stood before it, the steel door gleaming dully under the fluorescent lights, its surface cold to the touch. Unlike the other drawers, this one was secured with a heavy padlock, its edges pitted with rust but unyielding. He checked the keyring Vasile had given him, flipping through the keys one by one, their metal edges biting into his fingers. None fit. He frowned, returning to the logbook, his eyes scanning the page. There, in spidery, uneven script, was a single entry, Lina Ionescu. No date of death. No cause of death. The absence of details was a violation of every protocol Emile had ever known, a gap in the record that felt deliberate, almost malicious. No forensic pathologist would leave such an entry incomplete, not without reason. Strange, he muttered, his voice swallowed by the room's oppressive quiet. He tested the padlock again, tugging at it with a gloved hand, the metal cold enough to burn. It didn't budge, its weight a silent challenge. Emile stepped back, his breath fogging in the air, curling like smoke in the frigid room. The refrigeration units hummed, their drone filling the silence, but it felt wrong somehow, like a song played in a minor key, its notes discordant and unsettling. He flipped through the logbook surrounding pages, searching for more, but found nothing, no intake forms, no autopsy reports, no trace of Lina Ionescu beyond that single, cryptic line. He moved on to the other drawers, checking bodies and cross-referencing entries, his pen scratching notes in a steady rhythm. But his thoughts kept circling back to Cold Room 4, the locked drawer, a puzzle that refused to be ignored. Why was it locked? Who was Lina Ionescu, and why was her record so incomplete? The questions gnawed at him, persistent and unshakable, like a splinter lodged under his skin. He glanced at the clock, 2:17 a.m. The night stretched on, the silence growing heavier with each passing minute, the cold sinking deeper into his bones. Emile sat at the desk, his journal open before him, scribbling notes in an attempt to anchor himself in routine. The morgue was just a workplace, he told himself, a place of science, not superstition. But the air felt charged, as if the room were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. He glanced at the security monitor mounted on the wall, its grainy feed showing the row of refrigeration units. The image was still, unchanging, but something about it made his skin prickle, a sense of being watched. He leaned closer, squinting at the screen, and for a moment, he thought he saw a flicker, a shadow moving behind the glass of Cold Room 4's door, a faint outline that vanished as quickly as it appeared. His breath caught, his pulse racing. He stood, his chair scraping against the tile, the sound jarring in the quiet. He approached the units, his flashlight beam trembling as it cut through the dimness. The padlock on Cold Room 4 was untouched, its surface gleaming under the lights, the drawer sealed. He shone the light through the small glass window, but the beam revealed nothing but darkness, an empty void that seemed to swallow the light. No body, no movement, just an absence that felt heavier than any presence. Yet the unease in his chest grew, a tight knot that refused to loosen. "Who's there?" he called, his voice trembling slightly, echoing off the tiles. The silence answered, heavy and mocking, a presence in itself. He checked the other drawers, half expecting to find something, someone, out of place, but everything was as it should be, the bodies silent in their frozen sleep. He returned to the desk, his hands shaking as he scribbled a note in his journal, 2:34 a.m. possible shadow on security feed, Cold Room 4. Padlock secure. No explanation. The words looked stark on the page, a confession of something he couldn't yet understand. He tried to focus on the inventory, but the silence seemed to thicken, pressing against his eardrums like water at the bottom of a lake. The refrigeration unit's hum shifted, taking on a rhythm that felt almost deliberate, like whispered words just beyond comprehension. Emile glanced at cold room 4 again, and for a moment, he could have sworn the padlock gleamed, as if catching a light that wasn't there. He shook his head, rubbing his eyes, his breath fogging in the frigid air. Exhaustion, he told himself. The late hour and Vasilei's cryptic warning were playing tricks on his mind. But as he sat back down, the silence seemed to shift, no longer empty but alive, watching him from the shadows. The clock ticked on, each second a reminder that the night was far from over, and Emile couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting, just beyond the edge of his vision. The morgue was a tomb, its silence a weight that pressed against Emile's temples, heavy and unrelenting. He worked through the inventory, his hands moving mechanically, but his mind was elsewhere, tethered to cold room 4. The padlock, the incomplete record, Vasilei's warning, they swirled in his thoughts, a puzzle with no edges, a mystery that refused to be solved. It was just past 3 a.m. when the sound came, a sharp, metallic clank, like a tool dropped on the floor, echoing through the autopsy suite. Emile's pen froze mid-sentence, his heart thudding in his chest. He sat still, listening, the air charged with a tension he couldn't name. The morgue was silent again, but the silence felt different now, alive with anticipation. Emile stood slowly, his chair creaking against the tile, the sound jarring in the quiet. He approached the refrigeration units, his flashlight beam trembling as it cut through the dimness. The sound had come from cold room 4, he was certain of it. He checked the padlock, running his fingers over its rusted surface, the metal cold enough to burn. It was secure, unmoved, its weight a silent rebuke. But as he turned away, a flicker on the security monitor caught his eye. The screen, mounted above the desk, displayed a grainy feed of the refrigeration area, its black and white image flickering wildly, static dancing across the screen like a storm. For a split second, Emile thought he saw movement, a shadow shifting behind the glass of cold room 4's door, a faint outline that moved with purpose before vanishing into the static. His breath caught, his pulse racing. He approached the monitor, squinting at the screen, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. The image stabilized, showing nothing but the row of steel doors, their surfaces unmarred, the room silent and still. He shook his head, trying to dismiss it. The morgue was old, its equipment outdated, prone to glitches. A trick of the light, nothing more. But as he turned back to the units, he froze. There, on the glass window of cold room 4, was a handprint. It was faint, smudged, and unmistakably wet, as if someone had pressed their palm against the inside of the glass, their fingers splayed in a silent plea. Emile's stomach lurched, a wave of nausea washing over him. He checked the padlock again, still locked, still untouched. He shone his flashlight through the window, the beam trembling in his hand, but it revealed nothing but darkness, an empty void that seemed to swallow the light. "Who's there?" he called, his voice louder now, edged with panic, echoing off the tiles. The silence answered, heavy and predatory, as if the morgue itself were listening, waiting for him to make a move. He backed away, his flashlight beam darting across the room, catching the glint of steel, the flicker of shadows that seemed to move on their own. He checked the other drawers, his hands shaking as he pulled each one open, half expecting to find something, someone, out of place. But the bodies were as they should be, pale and still, their faces frozen in the finality of death. He returned to the desk, his hands trembling as he scribbled a note in his journal, 3:04 a.m. handprint on cold room 4. Wet, from inside. Padlock secure. No explanation. The words looked stark on the page, a testament to a reality he wasn't ready to accept. He glanced at the clock, 3:15 a.m. The night seemed to stretch endlessly, the silence growing heavier, the cold sinking deeper into his bones. He tried to focus on the inventory, but his eyes kept drifting to the security monitor, its grainy feed a constant reminder of what he'd seen, or thought he'd seen. The refrigeration unit's hum seemed to shift again, taking on a rhythm that felt almost human, like whispered words just beyond comprehension. Emil's eyes drifted to cold room 4, its steel door gleaming under the fluorescent lights, the handprint still visible, faint but unmistakable. He stood again, approaching the drawer, his flashlight beam steady now, though his heart was not. He pressed his ear to the door, holding his breath, listening for any sound. There was nothing, no clank, no whisper, just the relentless hum of the units. But as he pulled away, the air grew colder, the chill wrapping around him like a second skin. He returned to the desk, his journal open before him, and wrote, 3:27 a.m. No further sounds. Handprint still visible. I'm not imagining this. The words felt like a lifeline, a way to anchor himself in a reality that was slipping away. He glanced at the security monitor again, but the feed was clear, the room empty. The clock ticked on, each second a reminder that the night was far from over. Emil sat back, his hands clasped tightly together, trying to steady his breathing. But the silence was no longer just silence, it was a presence, a weight, a thing that watched him from the shadows, waiting for its moment to speak. The autopsy suite was colder than ever, the air biting at Emil's fingertips as he prepared for a routine examination. The body on the table was an elderly man, Ion Popescu, aged 72, a heart attack victim whose face was slack and gray, his eyes half open in the unseeing stare of death. The logbook listed him as unremarkable, no complications expected, just another name in the endless procession of the dead. Emil adjusted the overhead light, its harsh beam illuminating the body's waxy skin, casting stark shadows across the room. He picked up a scalpel, its weight familiar in his hand, and began the Y incision, his movements precise despite the unease that clung to him like damp cloth. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigeration units and the occasional drip of condensation from the ceiling. He was halfway through the incision, the blade slicing through flesh with a soft, wet sound, when it came, a faint, breathy whisper, like wind rustling through dry leaves. I'm cold. I don't belong here. Emil's scalpel clattered to the table, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. He spun around, his heart pounding, his eyes scanning the suite. The door was locked from the inside, its bolt firmly in place. The windows, high and narrow, were sealed, their surfaces fogged with condensation. The room was empty, save for him and the body on the table. His breath came in short, sharp gasps, fogging in the frigid air, curling like smoke before dissipating. He stood frozen, the scalpel still on the table, his hands trembling. The whisper had been clear, unmistakable, a woman's voice, soft but insistent, carrying a weight of sorrow that made his chest ache. He waited, listening, his ears straining for any sound, but the silence returned, heavier now, as if the room were holding its breath, waiting for him to move. Who's there? He demanded, his voice sharper than he intended, cutting through the quiet like a blade. The silence mocked him, unyielding, a presence that seemed to press against his skin. He checked the body on the table, half expecting its eyes to snap open, its lips to move, but Ion Popescu remained still, his face frozen in death. Emil forced himself to pick up the scalpel, his hands unsteady, and resumed the autopsy. Each cut was an act of defiance, a way to anchor himself in the routine of his work, to push back against the fear that coiled in his gut. But the whisper lingered in his mind, a splinter he couldn't dislodge, its words echoing in the silence, "I'm cold. I don't belong here." When he finished, he cleaned the table meticulously, scrubbing away every trace of blood and tissue, the act mechanical, a way to keep his hands busy while his mind raced. The overhead light buzzed, its flicker casting fleeting shadows that seemed to move at the edge of his vision. He glanced at Cold Room 4, its steel door looming at the edge of the room, the handprint from the previous night gone, the glass clean and unmarred. But the memory of it was vivid, a mark burned into his thoughts, as real as the whisper he'd just heard. He locked the suite and returned to the desk, his journal open before him. He wrote, 3:47 a.m. heard a voice during autopsy. Female. Said she was cold, didn't belong here. No source identified. The words felt inadequate, unable to capture the chill that had settled in his chest, the sense that the morgue was no longer just a place of death but something alive, something watching. He glanced at the security monitor, its grainy feed showing the refrigeration units, their steel doors silent and still. But the image felt wrong, as if it were hiding something, a truth just beyond the edge of the screen. Emile stood, pacing the room, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He checked the door again, confirming it was locked, then moved to the windows, peering through the fogged glass. The city outside was a blur of gray, the fog swallowing the streetlights, leaving only a faint glow. He turned back to the autopsy suite, his eyes drawn to Cold Room 4. The padlock gleamed under the fluorescent lights, its surface unmarred, but the air around it felt heavier, colder, as if it were the center of the morgue's malevolence. He approached the drawer, his flashlight beam trembling as it cut through the dimness. He pressed his ear to the door, holding his breath, listening for any sound. There was nothing, no whisper, no clank, just the relentless hum of the refrigeration units. But as he pulled away, the air grew colder, the chill wrapping around him like a second skin. He backed away, his heart racing, and returned to the desk, his journal open before him. He wrote, 4:02 a.m. No further sounds. Cold Room 4 unchanged. I know what I heard. The words were a lifeline, a way to hold on to his sanity in a place that seemed determined to strip it away. He sat back, his hands clasped tightly together, trying to steady his breathing. The clock ticked over to 4:15 a.m., each second a reminder that the night was far from over. The silence was no longer just silence, it was a presence, a weight, a thing that watched him from the shadows. Emile glanced at Cold Room 4 again, its steel door a silent challenge, its padlock a lock on secrets he wasn't sure he wanted to uncover. But the whisper echoed in his mind, a voice that wasn't his, a plea that demanded to be heard. And as the night stretched on, Emile couldn't shake the feeling that the morgue was waiting for him to answer. Emile arrived early the next night, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep, his mind a tangle of fear and curiosity. The morgue's corridors seemed narrower, the shadows deeper, as if the building itself were closing in, its walls pressing against him like a trap. The whisper from the previous night echoed in his thoughts, its words a haunting refrain, I'm cold. I don't belong here. He was determined to find answers, to unravel the mystery of Cold Room 4 and Lina Ionescu, to prove to himself that he wasn't losing his grip on reality. The office was a cluttered room at the end of the corridor, its walls lined with dusty filing cabinets, their drawers stuffed with forgotten paperwork. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and old paper, the silence broken only by the occasional creak of the building settling. Emile began his search, rifling through the cabinets, his hands moving quickly, driven by a need to know. He found nothing at first, just endless forms, autopsy reports, and intake logs, all meticulously catalogued but offering no clues about Lina Ionescu or Cold Room 4. After an hour of searching, he found a box tucked under a shelf, its edges crumbling with age, its surface coated in a layer of dust that made him cough. Inside were cassette tapes, their labels faded but legible, written in a shaky hand, Dr. Petrescu, 1977. Emil's pulse quickened, a surge of adrenaline cutting through the fog of exhaustion. He carried the box to the desk and dug out an ancient tape player from a drawer, its buttons sticky with grime, its surface scratched and worn. He inserted the first tape and pressed play, the machine whirring to life with a reluctant groan. The voice that crackled through the speaker was low and tense, belonging to a man on the edge of breaking. "This is Dr. Petrescu, October 12, 1977, the voice began, its tone heavy with fear. "They don't stay dead. Not all of them. The experiments, the government wanted results, but they didn't understand what they were unleashing. Lina, she was the first. She speaks to me at night." Emil's blood ran cold, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. He played tape after tape, each one more frantic than the last, Petrescu's voice growing increasingly unhinged. Petrescu described silent experiments, conducted under the guise of medical research, funded by a shadowy branch of the military. Lina Ionescu had been a test subject, a young woman injected with a serum meant to preserve consciousness after death, a twisted attempt to defy mortality. The experiment had failed, or so Petrescu claimed. Lina's body had been sealed in Cold Room 4, her record erased from official documents, her existence reduced to a single line in the logbook. But she wasn't gone. Petrescu spoke of whispers in the dark, of movements in the refrigeration units, of eyes that opened when they shouldn't, staring at him with a gaze that held no life but no death either. The final tape ended with a scream, a raw, guttural sound that cut off abruptly, leaving only static. Emil sat back, his hands trembling, the tape player hissing like a dying breath. He glanced at Cold Room 4, its padlock gleaming under the fluorescent lights, its steel door a silent barrier between him and the truth. The morgue felt alive now, its silence a facade hiding something malevolent, a presence that watched him from the shadows. He ejected the tape and slipped it into his pocket, a piece of evidence he couldn't yet explain, its weight heavy in his hand. He spent the rest of the night listening to the tapes again, transcribing fragments into his journal, each word deepening the chill in his bones. October 14, 1977, she moves at night. The cameras don't catch her, but I hear her. She wants out. October 17, 1977, I saw her eyes. They're not human anymore. Emil's handwriting grew unsteady, his pen scratching across the page as he wrote, 4:23 a.m. found tapes from Dr. Petrescu. Confirms Lina Ionescu was part of experiments. She's still here. The words felt like a confession, an acknowledgement that the morgue was no longer a place of science but a prison for something that refused to die. He stood, pacing the office, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The air grew colder, the fluorescent lights flickering, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to move on their own. He checked the security monitor, but the feed was clear, the refrigeration unit silent and still. Yet the unease in his chest grew, a sense that the morgue was watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. He returned to the autopsy suite, his eyes drawn to Cold Room 4, its padlock a silent challenge. He approached the drawer, his flashlight beam trembling as it cut through the dimness. He pressed his ear to the door, listening, but there was nothing, no whisper, no movement, just the relentless hum of the units. He returned to the desk, his journal open before him, and wrote, 4:47 a.m. No further sounds. Tapes confirm experiments. I need to find her file. The clock ticked toward dawn, but the darkness outside the windows seemed to press closer, as if the city itself were conspiring to keep him here. Emile sat back, his hands clasped tightly together, trying to steady his breathing. But the silence was no longer just silence, it was a presence, a weight, a thing that watched him from the shadows, waiting for its moment to speak. The records room was a crypt of forgotten lives, its shelves sagging under the weight of files and dust, the air thick with the scent of mildew and decay. Emile spent his next shift there, driven by a need to know more about Lina Ionescu, to find proof that she was more than a name in a logbook, more than a whisper in the dark. The room was dimly lit, a single bulb flickering overhead, casting long shadows that seemed to shift as he moved. He worked methodically, pulling files from the shelves, his hands coated in dust, his eyes scanning pages for any mention of her name. After hours of searching, he found her file buried in a cabinet marked closed cases, its edges yellowed and curling, its surface brittle with age. He opened it carefully, the paper crackling under his fingers, and found a photograph tucked inside, a black and white image of a young woman, no older than 20. Her skin was pale, her dark hair framing a face that was both beautiful and haunting, her lips set in a thin line. But it was her eyes that stopped him, large, shadowed, and unreadable. They seemed to stare directly at him, their gaze heavy with intent, as if she knew she was being watched, as if she were watching him back. Emile's breath caught, his hands trembling as he held the photograph under the dim light. There was something unsettling about her face, a sense of wrongness that he couldn't name. He tucked the photo into his journal, its edges curling against the pages, and continued reading the file. But the information was maddeningly vague, only her name, age, and a single line, subject terminated, 1977. No cause of death, no autopsy report, no record of her life or her end. It was as if she had been erased, her existence reduced to a single photograph and a locked drawer. That night, as he patrolled the corridors, the morgue seemed darker, the shadows deeper, the silence heavier. The fluorescent lights buzzed erratically, their flicker casting fleeting shapes that vanished when he turned to look. He moved slowly, his flashlight beam cutting through the dimness, his footsteps echoing in the quiet. He was halfway down the corridor when he saw her, a fleeting glimpse at the end of the hall, a figure in a tattered gray dress, her hair wet and clinging to her face, her bare feet leaving a faint trail of water on the floor. Emile's heart pounded, his flashlight beam trembling as he followed. "Lina," he called, his voice barely a whisper, swallowed by the silence. The figure vanished around a corner, and when he reached it, the corridor was empty, the air colder than it should have been. He shone his light across the floor, finding the trail of water, its droplets glistening under the beam. He followed it, his pulse racing, but the trail ended abruptly, as if she had simply dissolved into the air. He stood there, his breath fogging, the silence pressing against him like a physical force. The lights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to move on their own. Emile returned to the autopsy suite, his hands shaking as he wrote in his journal, "For 12 a.m. saw a woman in the hall. Matches Lina's description from photograph. Water on the floor. No explanation." The words felt like a confession, an admission that the morgue was no longer just a workplace but a place where the impossible was real. He sat at the desk, the photograph of Lina staring up at him from his journal, her eyes unblinking, unwavering. He studied her face, searching for some clue, some hint of who she was, but the image offered nothing but silence. The air grew colder, the fluorescent lights flickering, their buzz growing louder, more insistent. Emile stood, pacing the room, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He checked the security monitor, but the feed was clear, the refrigeration unit silent and still. But the unease in his chest grew, a sense that the morgue was watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. He approached cold room 4, his flashlight beam trembling as it cut through the dimness. The padlock gleamed under the lights, its surface unmarred, but the air around it felt heavier, colder, as if it were the center of the morgue's malevolence. He pressed his ear to the door, listening, but there was nothing, no whisper, no movement, just the relentless hum of the units. He returned to the desk, his journal open before him, and wrote, 4:38 a.m. No further sightings. Photograph confirms Lena's appearance. I need to know more. The clock ticked toward dawn, but the darkness outside the windows seemed to press closer, as if the city itself were conspiring to keep him here. The fog was thicker the next evening, swallowing the city in a gray haze that seemed to seep into Emile's bones. He arrived at the morgue to find a man waiting at the entrance, his face gaunt and his eyes wild with fear, their whites gleaming in the dim light. He introduced himself as Soren, a former attendant who had worked the night shift years ago, his hands trembling as he spoke. You've seen her, haven't you? He asked, his voice low and unsteady, as if afraid the walls themselves might hear. Lena. She doesn't stay dead. Emile ushered him inside, his curiosity outweighing the unease that coiled in his gut. They sat in the office, the air heavy with the scent of dust and decay, the silence broken only by the faint hum of the refrigeration units in the distance. Soren's hands shook as he spoke, his words tumbling out in a rush, his eyes darting to the shadows as if expecting her to appear. He described a night years ago when he'd been preparing a body for autopsy, the routine as familiar to him as breathing. The body, Lena's, had been pale and still, her eyes closed, her face serene. But as he made the first incision, her eyes snapped open, their gaze locking onto his, unblinking and empty. She spoke to me, Soren whispered, his voice barely audible, his hands clenching into fists. She said, you can't cut me. I'm still here. I dropped the scalpel, ran out of the suite, and never came back. But she's still here, isn't she? She's always here. Emile's stomach churned, a wave of nausea washing over him. He pulled the photograph of Lena from his journal and showed it to Soren, watching the man's face pale, his eyes widening in recognition. That's her, Soren said, his voice trembling. That's Lena. You've seen her too, haven't you? In the halls, in the shadows. She doesn't leave. Emile nodded, his throat tight, unable to deny the truth in Soren's words. He asked for more details, but Soren's story was fragmented, a jumble of fear and memory. He spoke of whispers in the dark, of footsteps in empty corridors, of a cold that followed him even outside the morgue. I left that night, Soren said, but it didn't matter. She followed me. In my dreams, in the streets. I came to warn you. Leave, before she takes you too. Before Emile could ask more, a sound interrupted them, a low, rhythmic tapping from the direction of the refrigeration units, like fingers drumming on metal. Soren stood, his eyes wide, his face drained of color. She knows I'm here, he whispered, his voice barely audible. He bolted for the door, his footsteps echoing down the corridor, disappearing into the fog outside. Emile stood alone, the tapping growing louder, more insistent, a summons he couldn't ignore. He moved to the autopsy suite, his flashlight beam trembling as it cut through the dimness. The tapping was coming from cold room 4, its rhythm deliberate, almost human. He approached the drawer, his heart racing, and pressed his ear to the door. The tapping stopped, replaced by a faint, breathy whisper. "Soren, he left me." Emil stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. He checked the security monitor, but the feed was clear, the room empty. He wrote in his journal, 5:03 a.m. tapping from cold room 4. Heard Lena's voice again. "Soren's story confirms my sightings." The words felt like a confession, a step closer to a truth he wasn't ready to face. He spent the rest of the night pacing, his thoughts a tangle of fear and determination. The photograph of Lena lay open on the desk, her eyes staring up at him, unblinking, unwavering. The air grew colder, the fluorescent lights flickering, their buzz growing louder, more insistent. Emil checked the door, the windows, the security feed, but everything was as it should be, except for the cold, except for the tapping, except for the whisper that lingered in his mind. The clock ticked toward dawn, but the darkness outside seemed to press closer, as if the morgue were a world unto itself, a place where the rules of reality no longer applied. The morgue grew colder with each passing night, the air so frigid that Emil's breath formed clouds even when the air conditioning was off, their shapes curling like ghosts before dissipating into the dimness. He worked in silence, his thoughts consumed by Lena Ionescu, the photograph, and Soren's warning. The autopsy suite was a sterile prison, its walls closing in, its silence a weight that pressed against his temples. He prepared another body, a young woman killed in a car accident, her face bruised but peaceful, her body cold and still under the overhead light. As he made the first incision, the tapping began again, faint but insistent, coming from cold room 4. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like a code he couldn't decipher. Emil paused, his scalpel hovering over the body, his heart racing. He set the scalpel down and approached the drawer, his flashlight beam trembling as it cut through the dimness. The padlock gleamed under the fluorescent lights, its surface unmarred, but the air around it was colder, heavier, as if it were the center of the morgue's malevolence. He pressed his ear to the door, holding his breath, listening. The tapping stopped, replaced by a voice, soft and plaintive, its words clear despite the whisper. "Let me out. I'm so cold." Emil stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat, his flashlight clattering to the floor. The voice was Lena's, he was certain of it, though he had no proof, no rational explanation. He checked the security monitor, its grainy feed showing the refrigeration units, their steel doors silent and still. But the image felt wrong, as if it were hiding something, a truth just beyond the edge of the screen. He retrieved his flashlight and returned to the body on the table, forcing himself to continue the autopsy. Each cut was an act of defiance, a way to push back against the fear that coiled in his gut. But the cold grew unbearable, the air so frigid it burned his lungs, his breath forming clouds that lingered longer than they should. He glanced at the thermostat, set to a steady 4 degrees Celsius, but the room felt closer to freezing, the chill seeping into his bones, his thoughts. He finished the autopsy and cleaned the table, his hands shaking as he scrubbed away the blood. The tapping had stopped, but the silence was worse, a presence that watched him from the shadows. He wrote in his journal, 4:53 a.m. tapping from cold room 4. Heard Lena's voice again. Said she was cold, wanted out. No source identified. The words felt inadequate, unable to capture the terror that gripped him, the sense that the morgue was no longer a place of science but a prison for something that refused to die. He stood, pacing the room, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The fluorescent lights flickered, their buzz growing louder, more insistent, like a swarm of insects. He checked the door, the windows, the security feed, but everything was as it should be, except for the cold, except for the voice, except for the tapping that lingered in his mind. He approached cold room 4 again, his flashlight beam steady now, though his heart was not. He pressed his ear to the door, listening, but there was nothing, no whisper, no movement, just the relentless hum of the units. He returned to the desk, his journal open before him, and wrote, 5:12 a.m. No further sounds. Cold room 4 unchanged. I'm not imagining this. The clock ticked toward dawn, but the darkness outside seemed to press closer, as if the morgue were a world unto itself, a place where the rules of reality no longer applied. Emile sat back, his hands clasped tightly together, trying to steady his breathing. But the silence was no longer just silence, it was a presence, a weight, a thing that watched him from the shadows, waiting for its moment to speak. Desperate for answers, Emile broke into the morgue's restricted archives, a basement room sealed behind a rusted gate, its air thick with dust and the scent of decay. The room was a labyrinth of shelves, their surfaces sagging under the weight of forgotten files, the silence broken only by the occasional creak of the building settling. He worked by flashlight, its beam cutting through the dimness, his hands coated in dust as he pulled files from the shelves, searching for any mention of Lina Ionescu. After hours of searching, he found the black file in a locked drawer, its cover stamped classified in faded red ink. He pried the drawer open with a crowbar, the metal screeching in protest, and pulled the file free. Its pages were brittle, yellowed, filled with dense, typewritten text and handwritten notes in a shaky script. The file detailed illegal medical experiments conducted in the 1970s, funded by a shadowy branch of the military, their purpose cloaked in secrecy. Lina Ionescu had been a subject, a young woman injected with a serum meant to preserve consciousness after death, a twisted attempt to defy mortality. The experiment had failed, trapping her in a liminal state, neither alive nor dead, her body sealed in cold room 4 to hide the evidence. Emile's hands shook as he read, his flashlight beam trembling across the pages. The file listed other subjects, their fates unknown, their bodies buried in unmarked graves behind the morgue. Lina's name appeared again and again, her death marked as inconclusive, her record erased from official documents. There were notes from Dr. Petrescu, his handwriting growing increasingly erratic, describing whispers in the dark, movements in the refrigeration units, a presence that refused to leave. She's still here, one note read, underlined so heavily the pen had torn the paper. Emile tucked the file under his coat, its weight heavy in his hands, and left the archives, the gate creaking shut behind him. He returned to the autopsy suite, the black file open on the desk, its pages a map of horrors he couldn't unsee. He wrote in his journal, 5:27 a.m. found black file in archives. Confirms Lina was part of experiments. Body sealed in cold room 4. Others buried behind morgue. The words felt like a confession, a step closer to a truth he wasn't ready to face. He stood, pacing the room, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The air grew colder, the fluorescent lights flickering, their buzz growing louder, more insistent. He checked the security monitor, but the feed was clear, the refrigeration unit silent and still. But the unease in his chest grew, a sense that the morgue was watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. He approached cold room 4, his flashlight beam trembling as it cut through the dimness. The padlock gleamed under the lights, its surface unmarred, but the air around it was colder, heavier, as if it were the center of the morgue's malevolence. He pressed his ear to the door, listening, but there was nothing, no whisper, no movement, just the relentless hum of the units. He returned to the desk, his journal open before him, and wrote, 5:42 a.m. No further sounds. Black file confirms experiments. I need to find the graves. The clock ticked toward dawn, but the darkness outside seemed to press closer, as if the morgue were a world unto itself, a place where the rules of reality no longer applied. That night, Emile dreamed of Cold Room 4. He was inside, the air so cold it burned his lungs, the walls coated in frost that glistened like diamonds. Lena stood before him, her eyes black and bottomless, her hair wet and clinging to her face, her tattered gray dress dripping water onto the floor. She reached for him, her fingers wrapping around his throat, their touch like ice, her voice a whisper that echoed in his mind, "You can't leave me. I'm still here." He woke gasping, his hands clawing at his neck, his skin bruised with faint purple marks that hadn't been there before. He stopped sleeping, his days blurring into nights, his mind a fog of fear and exhaustion. He caught himself muttering to himself, his voice unfamiliar, his words not his own. His handwriting in his journal grew erratic, the letters jagged and uneven, as if written by someone else. One entry, scrawled in a hand he didn't recognize, read, "She's here. She's always here." He stared at the words, his heart racing, the photograph of Lena staring up at him from the desk, her eyes unblinking, unwavering. He spent his shifts watching the security footage, searching for proof of Lena's presence, but the tapes showed only him, alone in the morgue, speaking to empty air, his lips moving in conversations he didn't remember. The cold grew unbearable, the air heavy with a presence he couldn't see but could feel, watching him from the shadows. He wrote in his journal, 4:58 a.m. dreamed of Lena. Bruises on neck. Handwriting not mine. She's doing this to me. The words felt like a confession, an admission that he was no longer in control. He stood, pacing the autopsy suite, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The fluorescent lights flickered, their buzz growing louder, more insistent, like a swarm of insects. He checked the door, the windows, the security feed, but everything was as it should be, except for the cold, except for the presence, except for the words in his journal that weren't his. He approached Cold Room 4, his flashlight beam trembling as it cut through the dimness. The padlock gleamed under the lights, its surface unmarred, but the air around it was colder, heavier, as if it were the center of the morgue's malevolence. He pressed his ear to the door, listening, but there was nothing, no whisper, no movement, just the relentless hum of the units. He returned to the desk, his journal open before him, and wrote, 5:19 a.m. No further sounds. I'm losing myself. She's in my head. The clock ticked toward dawn, but the darkness outside seemed to press closer, as if the morgue were a world unto itself, a place where the rules of reality no longer applied. Following an address in the black file, Emile found Lena's old home, a crumbling tenement on the city's edge, its walls sagging under the weight of years, its windows boarded up and streaked with grime. The air was thick with the scent of rot, the fog curling through the streets like a living thing. He entered the building, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, revealing peeling wallpaper and floors littered with debris. The staircase creaked under his weight, each step a protest, as if the house itself were warning him to leave. Lena's apartment was on the third floor, its door ajar, its hinges rusted and loose. Inside, the walls were covered in drawings, crude, frenzied sketches of a woman with hollow eyes, her face contorted in fear or rage, her hands reaching out as if to grasp something just beyond the page. Emile's breath caught, his flashlight beam trembling as he studied the drawings, their lines chaotic, their details disturbingly familiar. It was Lena, her face unmistakable, her eyes the same as those in the photograph. He moved through the apartment, his footsteps echoing in the silence, the air heavy with a presence he couldn't name. A neighbor, an old woman with trembling hands and eyes that darted to the shadows, appeared at the door, her voice a whisper. "She still comes back," she said, her words heavy with fear. "Every night, she walks these halls. You shouldn't be here." Emile tried to ask more, but the woman retreated, her door slamming shut, the sound echoing through the tenement. He felt her presence in the apartment, a weight in the air, a chill that followed him as he moved. The drawings seemed to watch him, their eyes unblinking, unwavering. He found a journal on a table, its pages filled with Lena's handwriting, its words a chaotic jumble of fear and despair. "They took me. They made me this. I can't leave." Emile tucked the journal under his coat, its weight heavy in his hands, and left the apartment, the drawings burned into his memory. As he stepped into the street, he heard footsteps behind him, soft and deliberate, but when he turned, the street was empty, the fog swallowing the light. He returned to the morgue, his journal open before him, and wrote, 5:34 a.m. found Lena's apartment. Drawings confirm her identity. Neighbor says she still returns. Journal suggests she's trapped. The words felt like a confession, a step closer to a truth he wasn't ready to face. Emile pried open cold room 4, the padlock yielding under a crowbar, its metal screeching in protest. The drawer slid open with a hiss, revealing nothing but frost and dried blood, smeared across the floor in patterns that looked deliberate, like symbols from a forgotten language. Emile's breath caught, his flashlight beam trembling as it traced the patterns, their lines chaotic but purposeful, as if drawn by someone, or something, with intent. He checked the security footage from the previous night, his heart racing as he watched. The screen showed him standing in front of the drawer, speaking to someone who wasn't there, his lips moving in words he didn't remember saying. "I'll help you, Lena. I'll set you free." The footage was clear, unmistakable, a record of a moment he couldn't recall. He wrote in his journal, 5:02 a.m. opened cold room 4. Found blood patterns. Security footage shows me talking to no one. I don't remember this. He stood, pacing the autopsy suite, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The air grew colder, the fluorescent lights flickering, their buzz growing louder, more insistent. He checked the door, the windows, the security feed, but everything was as it should be, except for the blood, except for the footage, except for the words he didn't remember saying. The photograph of Lena lay open on the desk, her eyes staring up at him, unblinking, unwavering. He approached cold room 4 again, his flashlight beam trembling as it cut through the dimness. The blood patterns were still there, their lines glistening under the light, as if freshly drawn. He pressed his ear to the drawer, listening, but there was nothing, no whisper, no movement, just the relentless hum of the units. He returned to the desk, his journal open before him, and wrote, 5:27 a.m. blood patterns unchanged. Footage confirms I'm losing control. She's doing this to me. The clock ticked toward dawn, but the darkness outside seemed to press closer, as if the morgue were a world unto itself, a place where the rules of reality no longer applied. Lena appeared to him that night, her form flickering like a bad signal, her hair wet and clinging to her face, her skin a sickly blue, her tattered gray dress dripping water onto the floor. She stood in the center of the autopsy suite, her eyes black and bottomless, her voice a hiss that echoed in his mind, "Bury the truth, Emile. Bury it with me." He stumbled back, his vision swimming, the room dissolving into a void, the walls fading into darkness. Lena's hands reached for him, their touch like ice, pulling him toward a place where light and warmth no longer existed. He woke on the floor, his journal open to a new page, filled with words he hadn't written. She never left. The cold was unbearable now, the air thick with her presence, her voice a whisper that lingered in his mind. He wrote, 4:49 a.m. saw Lena in the suite. She spoke to me. I don't know what's real anymore. The words felt like a confession, an admission that he was no longer in control, that the morgue had claimed him as its own. He stood, pacing the room, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The fluorescent lights flickered, their buzz growing louder, more insistent. He checked the door, the windows, the security feed, but everything was as it should be, except for the cold, except for the presence, except for the words in his journal that weren't his. He approached cold room 4, his flashlight beam trembling as it cut through the dimness. The blood patterns were still there, their lines glistening under the light, as if alive. He pressed his ear to the drawer, listening, but there was nothing, no whisper, no movement, just the relentless hum of the units. He returned to the desk, his journal open before him, and wrote, 5:14 a.m. No further sightings. She's in my head. I can't escape her. The clock ticked toward dawn, but the darkness outside seemed to press closer, as if the morgue were a world unto itself, a place where the rules of reality no longer applied. Driven by desperation, Emile dug in the lot behind the morgue, his shovel striking bone after bone, the earth cold and unyielding. The fog hung low, swallowing the light, the air thick with the scent of decay. He found unmarked graves, dozens of them, each with a hospital bracelet, their names faded but legible. One bore Lena's name, but the body was fresh, as if buried yesterday, its skin pale and unmarred, its eyes closed in a mockery of sleep. Emile called the police, his voice trembling as he described the graves, the bracelets, the truth buried behind the morgue. But when they arrived, the lot was pristine, untouched, the earth smooth and unbroken. The officers looked at him with pity, their radios crackling with static, their faces skeptical. Emile led them to the spot, but there was nothing, no graves, no bones, no bracelets. He wrote in his journal, 5:37 a.m. found graves behind morgue. Police found nothing. They think I'm mad. He returned to the morgue, his journal now a chaotic mess of notes and drawings, some in his handwriting, some in Lena's. The photograph of Lena lay open on the desk, her eyes staring up at him, unblinking, unwavering. The air grew colder, the fluorescent lights flickering, their buzz growing louder, more insistent. He checked the door, the windows, the security feed, but everything was as it should be, except for the graves, except for the truth, except for the presence that watched him from the shadows. He approached cold room 4, his flashlight beam trembling as it cut through the dimness. The blood patterns were still there, their lines glistening under the light, as if alive. He pressed his ear to the drawer, listening, but there was nothing, no whisper, no movement, just the relentless hum of the units. He returned to the desk, his journal open before him, and wrote, 5:59 a.m. No further evidence. She's taken it all. I'm alone. The clock ticked toward dawn, but the darkness outside seemed to press closer, as if the morgue were a world unto itself, a place where the rules of reality no longer applied. Emile's final night in the morgue was a descent into madness, the boundaries between reality and nightmare dissolving like frost under a flame. The security footage showed him alone, speaking to empty air, performing an autopsy on a table with no body, his hands moving with a precision that wasn't his. His journal, now filled with Lena's handwriting, ended with a plea, don't work the night shift. They never leave. The words were scrawled in a jagged hand, their lines chaotic, their meaning a warning he hadn't heeded. He stood in the autopsy suite, the photograph of Lena staring up at him from the desk, her eyes unblinking, unwavering. The air was so cold it burned his lungs, his breath forming clouds that lingered longer than they should. The fluorescent lights flickered, there buzzed a swarm of insects, their light casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to move on their own. He checked the security monitor, but the feed was clear, the refrigeration unit silent and still. But the unease in his chest was a living thing, a weight that pressed against his heart, a truth he couldn't deny. He approached cold room 4, his flashlight beam trembling as it cut through the dimness. The blood patterns were still there, their lines glistening under the light, as if alive. He pressed his ear to the drawer, listening, but there was nothing, no whisper, no movement, just the relentless hum of the units. He returned to the desk, his journal open before him, and wrote, 5:48 a.m. She's one. I'm not me anymore. The words were a confession, an admission that the morgue had claimed him, that Lena had claimed him. When the police reviewed the tapes, they found no evidence of Lena, no graves, no black file. Only Emil, screaming into the void, his hands moving over an empty table, his voice a plea for something that wasn't there. He was committed to an asylum the next day, his story dismissed as delusion, his journal confiscated as evidence of his madness. But in the morgue, cold room 4 remains locked, its secrets buried in frost, its whispers echoing in the silence, a testament to a truth that refuses to die.